Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen of Virginia Peninsula, welcome to this is week 10 already of your 12-week class. Boy, it sure has gone by fast, hasn't it? Um, Today I'm caught up with grading, trying to remember if there was any notes I had about that. I don't think so. If I forgot something, I apologize. Today we are covering the Renaissance, which is there's actually two parts to it. There's the early Renaissance, high Renaissance, and then this what I call an art rebellion against this. The Renaissance was a revival of Greek classicism and classical values, and there was this sculpture and painting rebellion against that. I call it a rebellion called Mannerism. So we'll take a look at some Mannerism projects. Next week will be the Northern Renaissance, and that will be our last official lecture for the term, okay? So next week I'll talk a bit more about the final exam and grading and all the rest of it. So that'll be next week. All right, so let us get into this. So I fixed my problem with the visual. I think it had something to do with the fact that when I do office hours, um, I don't sit in my chair here. I find it easier to just go sit in the living room and do some other work um, and I have a monitor in the living room, and I think the monitor kind of mirrors what's going on here so that I can see if someone comes into the room for office hours. And I forgot to turn that off, and I think it was interfering with. Anyway, that's a long explanation. I think I got it fixed. So when I talk about the early and the high Renaissance, the statue you're looking at of David is part of the high Renaissance in Rome. And of course, obviously, you can think about that in terms of what I showed you in ancient Greece. Remember the nude males I showed you in ancient Greece with the contrapposto bent knee, and here we have Michelangelo's homage to the that particular type of statue with his monstrous statue of David. But the Renaissance actually began in Florence, and the early Renaissance ran from 1400 to 1494. And if you recall last week when we were discussing the late Middle Ages, I mentioned that late Middle Ages went from 1300 to 1500, and so you had that period between 1400 and 1500 where there's this transition from the late Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. They just sort of melded into each other. And so here we have early Renaissance is 1494 or 1400 to 1494. And here this is kind of a famous painting from this it's the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden after Adam and Eve's sin. So let's take a look at an analysis of it.
The Expulsion by Masaccio. The sin committed by Adam and Eve is followed by the condemnation with their expulsion from...
Oh, sorry. I better check this to make sure. I better check this. Yeah, I did click these. Okay. Sorry.
Paradise on earth. The dramatic intensity of the biblical episode, together with Masaccio's mental and figurative attitude, allowed the artist to achieve not only one of the high points in his own art, but a high point in painting of all eras. Form and expression become a single inseparable whole in the two desperate figures, where the muscular body of Adam bends beneath the burden of sorrow and shame, and Eve's face is distorted by anguish. Their nakedness implies that Masaccio had looked at recent and ancient sculptural models, which for Adam could recall the torsos of classical statuary, but also the wooden Christ by Donatello in Santa Croce, while the attitude of Eve, hiding her breasts and pubic area, seems inspired by the type of Venus pudica seen in Hellenistic and Roman art. The dark halo surrounding the head and shoulders of Adam is not the artist's error, but simply testimony to the total loss of the original blue, which today has left us the legacy of the preparatory layer of pale blue. Depicted at a 3/4 angle, the two figures move strongly through the space, also marked by powerful glimpses of the gate to Eden and the angel who urges them on with a sword, once resplendent with silver leaf, now oxidized. The left hand of the angel indicates the barren and desolate land through which Adam and Eve move, projecting their shadows onto the ground, as if they were hit by the real light coming through the window to their right. Their physicality is now part of the world, just as their suffering is an inseparable part of human history.
Okay, so right away you can see how classical ideals from ancient Greece are being incorporated to paintings from this period. Hold on. My phone keeps toning. You can see how she mentioned that the bent knee and certain features like Eve's covering of her breasts and pubic area is similar to statues or sculptures from ancient Greece. So this just gives you some insight into the early Renaissance. So let us take a look now at the early Renaissance. Take note of the dome. We're going to talk about that in a little bit here, but this is sort of an introduction to Florence and the beginnings of the Renaissance.
The Renaissance was centered in Florence, the capital of Tuscany before Italy was unified. The word Renaissance literally means rebirth, and in this instance it was a rebirth of classical antiquity. It is important to split the Renaissance into the early Renaissance, beginning in Florence, and the High Renaissance, which moved the concentration of art of that period to Rome. It was fostered by scholars who studied at the recently opened University of Florence. This gave a secular, i.e. non-religious, education, especially one that was no longer connected to classical gods. The course was known as the Studia Humanitatis, and when qualified, the students were known as humanists. Such a humanist would be fluent in Latin and later, in the 15th century, Greek. The principal subjects were grammar, rhetoric, Latin, mathematics, geometry, music, and poetry. With these, they would debate philosophically and quote classical authors in which they were well versed. Most of the students went on to become speech authors and politicians, and therefore wielded great power in society. This was very important in the development of Renaissance art and architecture. The fact that they were classical bibliophiles was a huge change from the Gothic era, which was centered on fear, faith, and the power of the church. Why Florence? The Renaissance essentially happened in Florence due to three main reasons: the university, the industry of trade and textiles, and banking. Whilst the humanists were philosophical, the people of Florence were generally quite earthbound, pragmatic, practical people, which led to a large increase in documentation, and they were also hugely materialistic. The city prospered through trade of textiles particularly, and made a lot of money internationally. Wool was actually imported from Norfolk, silk and dyes from the east, as far out as Afghanistan, with which they made beautiful textiles. This trade encouraged the formation of guilds, mostly for cloth importers and bankers. The guilds themselves commissioned heavily, and therefore supported this great artistic flourishing. Many became quite wealthy from banking, and invested their money in education for children, especially as those humanists could then tutor them, and they invested in art. However, it is important to make a distinction here. It was not directly the humanists that set off the Renaissance, but indirectly through art commissions, political influence, and emulating the classicists.
Did you pick up at the beginning of this when she talked about how how certain individuals were moving away from the influence of the church, which up until that time had been able to exercise great power and fear into people. Again, this is not an indictment against the church itself. This is against representatives of the faith who took advantage of the power they had. And so people are beginning, I mean, a lot of people are beginning to see this and they're moving away from it. That is what the Renaissance is all about. It's not just about it's like a period of enlightenment is what it is. That individuals, maybe both intellectual and non-intellectual, are beginning to realize that life is changing. Remember the ancient Greeks, how they eventually began to praise themselves and move away from being puppets of the gods. Now you have the same thing happening, where in which people in general are beginning to move away from the power and the influence of the church. Maybe there's a connection there. I don't know. Maybe it's cyclical in history. Are we doing the same thing now with the power of our government? Are we the people moving away from that? I don't know. I'm not sure where we are in modern times, but I do know that that this Renaissance was like a period of enlightenment, and people were moving away from the power, and especially use the word fear, fear of the church. That's a powerful word to use. All right, so this is another example of art. This is Ghiberti's, I have to call it embossing process. I have no idea how he etched that in the metal panels that are on the doors, gold metal panels. Wow, that's an incredible piece of artwork. I have no idea how that was achieved, but it has that three-dimensional quality of it that was significant to this time period. We're going to learn a bit more about that with an individual named Brunelleschi. But obviously, the panels are still there because that's a photograph, and here's a detail of it on the right-hand side. My gosh, what incredible work. Wow, I can't even imagine. I could never do anything like this. This is absolutely stunning. And how many panels? One, two, three, 10 panels plus the the strips along the outside and the inside. Wow, what a talented person. Here we go. This is Brunelleschi, Filippo Brunelleschi. This is one you want to remember whenever you think about the Renaissance, the early Renaissance in Florence. There was this man named Filippo Brunelleschi, and how he contributed was two ways. One, remember what I just said a bit ago, that this Renaissance was a revival of classical values, which meant that art in particular needed to be as perfect looking and balanced as possible and beautiful. Those were the values. And one of the ways that Brunelleschi achieved this is by creating something called the vanishing point. You can see how it's played out here in a modern interpretation. He creates a horizon, and then from the horizon, he's able to build the work from the telephone poles and the railroad track from the background to the foreground. And what it did was give artists a literal ability to, or an ability to literally measure elements of the painting from the foreground to the background so that their relationship to each other is perfect, as if you were looking at them with your eyes or in a photograph. They could be created with painting. So he could measure that farthest telephone pole and measure all the telephone poles to the foreground so that they were they were perfect in their height in relation to the one behind it. And so this again gave painters this ability to reflect upon the classical values and create work that was probably more perfect than they could build statues or sculpture in ancient Greece. This was being applied to paintings, and you'll see some examples of this led to a three-dimensional perspective that became very popular during the Renaissance, and this is called linear perspective. I think others besides Brunelleschi were involved in this perspective, but he was the one who put forth this idea where you could measure your painting, measure the elements of it if you wanted to. Here is his other contribution. I showed you that dome a moment ago in the first video, and uh, that when that cathedral was first built in Florence, that there was a gaping hole where that dome should have been, and it turned out that architects of the time did not know how to cover it. And it was Brunelleschi who was somebody who was what we today would call an outside the box thinker. He did not think the way that normal architects did. He had his own way of perceiving things, kind of like latter day would be someone like Frank Lloyd Wright or I.M. Pei from China, who he's the one who created the glass pyramid that's over the doorway or the entryway into the Louvre in Paris. If you've been there, you probably have gone through underneath that to go down into the entryways. I haven't been there, but that's what it looks like as you go down to the entryway. Frank Lloyd Wright was the one who developed all those beautiful homes in Illinois and another one in Pittsburgh. In fact, if you're ever in the Pittsburgh area, there's a place called Falling Water House that he built in 1936. It's absolutely stunning. It's built over a creek. If you ever have a chance to go see it. Anyway, so Brunelleschi was the one who not only developed a way to build the dome, but he also is able to construct and design the mechanisms that were necessary to build it the way he wanted. So let's take a look at that.
We're in Florence and we're standing outside of the Duomo.
The Cathedral of Florence, and we're looking up at Brunelleschi's dome.
It's huge. Until St. Peter's, it was the highest dome that had ever been raised, and in its width, it was as wide as the Pantheon.
Almost.
If you think about the Duomo itself, had been planned in the 14th century.
The plan was to build a dome that had a span nearly equal to that of the Pantheon.
And of course, the Pantheon had been built in the ancient world, and that technology had largely been lost.
Right. So first and foremost, what Brunelleschi did was an amazing engineering achievement. The challenge was how to build a dome this wide without wooden centering. Generally, when you build an archway, and the dome is really just an arch in the round, you put up a wooden framework.
So this is the wood to actually support the dome until it can be locked in place by the keystone.
Exactly. So you don't even really need mortar to hold it together because you've got the keystone.
The problem is this was so big, they couldn't actually get enough lumber, and lumber that was strong enough to hold the thing up until they could lock it in place.
And so there was no way to do wooden scaffolding or centering to hold it up as it was being built. So how do you build this dome that inclines inward and not have it fall down?
There's two problems. You've got that issue, and then you've got the problem of it wanting to splay outward.
A dome exerts pressure not only down, but down and out. And so one of the biggest challenges is how to raise the dome and deal with that downward and outward pressure, not cracking the walls underneath.
Now, in the ancient world, for the Pantheon, for example, they had dealt with that by just creating sheer bulk. In other words, the walls got to be 10 feet thick.
I think actually in the Pantheon there's something like 20 feet thick of concrete. Right?
But Brunelleschi couldn't do that here. So what he's done instead is, first of all, he made the decision to make the dome as light as possible, and that means that it's basically hollow. It's a double shell, and within the shell is a staircase that snakes around that allows one actually to get to the top. And if you look, you can see people just below the lantern up at the top of the dome taking in the view of the city.
He also created ribs.
You're doing a lot of the weight bearing.
And then in between each of the major ribs, which are visible on the outside, there are two within that we can't see.
And those are actually locked in place by a series of horizontals as well. So there's this whole skeletal structure that's actually holding this piece together. I think most importantly, he was able to develop a system where as the dome was being raised up, as each course of stone and brick was added, it was actually locking itself in place, and so it was self-sustaining.
Another way that Brunelleschi dealt with the downward and outward thrust was to create chains inside the dome made out of stone and wood, locked together with iron, like a girdle to hold the dome in and to counter that downward and outward thrust.
You might think of an old-fashioned wooden barrel that has a couple of iron rings around it to help keep the wood together.
Brunelleschi created cantilevered scaffolding
that could rise as the building went up.
And so the workmen had a place to work. Brunelleschi also built new kinds of pulleys and hoists to bring up these heavy, massive pieces of stone to the top of the dome. So he created this ox hoist. There's just these remarkable machines that no one had ever seen before.
He actually even designed a special barge to go down the Arno to be able to bring the materials to the city itself. If you think about the sheer quantity of material that had to be imported and had to be hoisted up and had to be put in place, it is just this remarkable project.
Bricks that had to be created, stone that had to be quarried and brought here, platforms for the workmen to work on, machines to hoist everything. And I think it was Alberti who said something like, what Brunelleschi did, we did
without precedent.
Without having any example to lean on.
Utter invention.
Exactly.
Now, we think that Brunelleschi may have gone to Rome and may have studied ancient architecture as well as sculpture there, but there is no precedent in the ancient world even for what Brunelleschi accomplished here.
Now, it's important to say that the dome is not hemispherical like the dome on the Pantheon.
It's actually kind of tall.
Right, it's kind of pointed. In a way, it has more of a Gothic shape than a classical shape, but in that way, it matches the Gothic church itself. If you look closely, you can see these exedrae or blind tribunes that Brunelleschi added around the outside of the dome. They actually look very classical compared to the Gothic church. They, in fact, look like Roman triumphal arches. So there's this curious classical moment here in an otherwise very Gothic church.
And it's a church that is not only Gothic, but really referring back to the Tuscan Romanesque tradition, especially in terms of the polychromy, the colored marbles, which Brunelleschi also carries up into the barrel just below the dome itself. But ultimately, you've got Brunelleschi, who, through his engineering genius, is solving a problem the Western tradition had never been capable of solving before. How does one span this enormous space? And in order to do it, he's surpassing the ancients that he's even here paying reverence to.
So at the very end, they emphasize that the reason he was able to do this is because his genius was able to conceive of a way not only to build the dome, but also the mechanism necessary to do it. Again, today we would call that an outside the box thinker. So what does that mean for you? Think about those areas in your life where maybe you are an outside the box thinker, where maybe you think differently about something than many other people you know. It could be an indicator of the career or what you might be doing with your life. For me, it turned out to be stage theater. I didn't realize that many years ago I used to write magazine articles for part of my living. They never really paid much, but it was an indicator that I had an interest in writing. And it wasn't until later when I was doing my bachelor's degree that I just unexpectedly joined a theater group and realized that that was something I was very interested in. And in years after graduating, I operated my own acting studio, and I was involved in director of the theater group for another college, volunteer capacity as a faculty advisor. I mean, what do they call it? No, I wasn't on faculty at that school. Anyway, I was the staff advisor for the theater group at another college. So that is an area where I think I might be outside the box thinking. So think about those areas where you might be as well, where you're kind of a step ahead of everybody else in something. All right, so let's move on. All right, so let's take a look at Renaissance humanism. I think this is this sort of puts it encapsulates, or it reinforces the idea of people in general, at least intellectuals, moving away from the power of the church. And the church is beginning to accept this. They realize they can't stop progress. And so the church is, as intellectuals are beginning to want to revitalize the works of Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers from the past, the church is beginning to realize that this is a movement. They didn't call it humanism then, but it is a movement. And so the church needed to give space for these people to exist, as the narrator will say in this video. And it's important to keep remembering that this is a slow evolutionary process. Today, we don't think anything of individuals going to a church or a synagogue or a mosque for worship service and yet understanding how the world works in science and technology, etc. We take it for granted. But again, in this time frame, no, the church was a very powerful force in the lives of people. And when people begin moving away from that, it's not a disrespect. It's a way to say life is more complex than just this is God's will. It's more complex than that. That if it's God's will, it could be something else. It could be grounded in science and technology. Just like the science, there were no scientists then to know how the Black Plague was affecting people. They thought it was a punishment from God. Today, we know that COVID, we experienced the COVID pandemic 6 years ago, and we know that most people would say that's not necessarily a punishment from God. Some might believe that, but we have room for those who say no. It was scientifically based. We understood where it came from and how we could mitigate it with vaccinations. So let's take a look.
Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is Renaissance humanism. Now, in philosophy, the term humanism can refer to one of three things. Renaissance humanism, the broad cultural revival of ancient texts and ideas in the early Renaissance. Civic humanism, an offshoot of Renaissance humanism closely associated with quote-unquote classical republicanism. And modern humanism, a modern secular moral cognitivism which claims ethics and value do exist but should be derived from humans and other people, not a deity. As the title suggests, this video will focus on Renaissance humanism. It's important to note that Renaissance humanism was a movement identified and named by historians centuries later. While there were identifying features, it did not have a single unifying thesis, goal, or ideology, as many positions in philosophy do. Rather, it's a cultural movement that had a profound impact on the philosophy of its time. So if someone tells you Renaissance humanists believed X, they're probably overstating their case, because it's more of a cultural movement that had a lot of impacts on philosophy, but didn't have kind of one guiding ideology like a rationalism or an empiricism did. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was limited European access to ancient Greek texts due to a lack of translations. During this period, what limited academic study there was in Western Europe focused on theology and using philosophy to support it. Check out my video on scholasticism for more information. Renaissance humanism marked the end of scholastic dominance with the translation of many more Greek texts and the resurgence of the other humanities writ large, including rhetoric, grammar, poetry, ethics, and history. In fact, our modern term for the humanities is a namesake of the Renaissance humanist movement. Renaissance humanism rose to prevalence in Europe, primarily in Italy in the 1300s, and eventually spread around Europe by the 1600s. It was a cultural movement united by a translation and revival of the diverse range of classical texts and ideologies. These included some of the less philosophical works of Aristotle, such as the Poetics, which we're doing another series on right now, if you want to check that out, but also works by authors other than Plato and Aristotle, leading to revivals of Stoicism, skepticism, and Epicureanism. Much of the movement, however, was the translation and revival of the humanities outside of philosophy, such as literature. The wide range of texts and ideologies that experienced a resurgence make it impossible to identify one single ideology associated with Renaissance humanism. It is sometimes considered a secular movement, as it did result in less power in the hands of the church. A renewed focus on literature and material things lost in the ascetic religious Middle Ages, and the fact that modern humanism is explicitly secular. However, this is broadly inaccurate. There were religious and non-religious versions of humanism, Aristotelian and non-Aristotelian versions of humanism. The uniting factor was the revival of the lost texts and disciplines, not any particular viewpoint espoused by them. And so while Renaissance humanism may have led to less power for the church because it allowed for people who were further outside of the church, whether they were people that were religious but not identified with a particular Catholic ideology or people that were verging on non religious, it gave them space to exist because of some of these texts and some of the work that the texts did questioning those ideas of religion. And so the movement itself wasn't explicitly against the church, but by providing space for those viewpoints, it was often cast as that, despite having many very religious adherents within it. Renaissance humanism succeeded in resurrecting, translating, and distributing many texts from antiquity, and by the 1600s had spread throughout Europe. They laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and for modern philosophy. However, as these changes began to take place in European society, the study of the classics lost its power, but it still retained the importance placed on classical education and a full understanding of ancient societies. With the rise of science, some of Aristotle's scientific ideas and thoughts started to be proven to be wrong. And so this kind of left by the wayside some of the ancient works that had been revived within this period, as well as some of the scholastics who had based a lot of their physics and ideologies on Aristotle's works of science. But that didn't mean that the idea of the importance of the humanities had been lost, rather that science had gotten to the point where it could start making progress again because of this revival. Stay tuned for future videos on...
Okay, so under that major categories where you had in red, the one diverse, if you remember what he said that the church, because there was an interest by individuals, probably intellectuals, in the resurrection of classical literature by the ancients, that the church had to sort of give way and provide a space to exist for people who thought outside the church, which means the church is beginning to relinquish this power and fear that it had over people. I don't think it meant that individuals would. He even said there were religious believers within this humanist movement. It's just that they what they wanted to do, they didn't, maybe at the time they didn't realize what they were looking for was where we are today, where people can easily separate science, the faith, and reason, as Thomas Aquinas put it, and live lives very happily that way. And I think this was sort of this breaking point was happening during the Renaissance, and I think it was healthy. That's just my personal opinion. I think it was a healthy approach to life.
Welcome back.
So now let's move to the High Renaissance, where we move from 1494, when the early Renaissance ended, and we're moving now towards the High Renaissance. Renaissance has moved from Florence to Rome, and we have the High Renaissance from 1494 to 1564. This is when most of us think of the Renaissance. This is the one period we think of. And we right away, you think of I'm sure if you haven't been there to visit it, you're aware of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and this is a still image of that scene. It's absolutely incredible work. Incredible. So here's another one of the great painters of the time. There were three of the great painters. There are many, many, of course, but the three that have come down, their legacies have come down to us, would have been Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. This is an example of Raphael's masterpiece called The School of Athens. It is an homage to classical revivals, but look at the image itself. It's also employing that linear perspective established by Brunelleschi. Look at the three-dimension of it. Three-dimensional artwork then, in one of the videos I share, three-dimensional artwork then it was as popular as 3D movies are to us today. And so you see the perfect example of this, how this is a well-balanced painting, and it has that linear perspective where we see a foreground and a definitive background. So this is Raphael's master painting, masterwork. So here we have Da Vinci's masterwork, which is The Last Supper. This is a very, very, as famous as his Mona Lisa. This one is a very famous image of his, and it also is an homage to classical values and balance and perspective. And I'll share some of the elements with you that make it so. For one thing, you see Jesus centered in the window behind him, roughly centered, or the doorway. And the windows on either side of him are approximately the same distance from the door, and they're about the same size. If you look at the table where Jesus is seated, if you count the apostles on either side, they're equal, six on one side, six on the other. It's not eight on one and four on the other. Um, uh, it is six and six, which is a balance. If you look at the tapestries on the wall, there's the linear perspective again, the three-dimensional. If you look at the tapestries, they're all about the same size and they're spaced equidistant from each other. As you will see in the ceiling honeycomb, all of those cubicles up there are spaced about the same. They're about the same size. These are parts of that what make a painting a revival of classicism, classical values. So if you are a painter and you decide you want to try something like this, here you have the three dimension as well, linear perspective, as I said. If you want to experiment with a revival of classical values, you can do mathematically from the background to the foreground, and you can make all of these same elements in your artwork blend so that it's three-dimensional and you have this balance and perspective, which is so critical to, if you're going to do classical revival, this is the way you do it. So I think the next image I have for you, before we get to it, I mentioned that you can see the beauty of this piece of artwork. Well, hot on the heels of this was a movement called Mannerism. It is much more chaotic. It is much more distorted. And so you have a painter named Tintoretto who has developed his own version of the Last Supper, and there it is. So if you had to choose between that one and this one, which one do you think you might like? So this is very distinctive. This is so typical of Mannerism. You have things like the table running at an angle. You see the brightness of the halos around Jesus and the apostles. There's a lot of chaos here. There's a lot of distortion here. There's angels and lights and halos. And Tintoretto used this art style called chiaroscuro, which is a black background. This may have been more like the Last Supper was, rather than the serene image of this Last Supper. So this is how distinct Mannerism was from the classical revival. And I'll show you another example of it. You know who else became interested in Mannerism? Michelangelo himself, and I'll show you a couple of examples of a sculpture he created. So let's take a look at Da Vinci's inventions. Remember, he was not only a great painter, but he was also an inventor. Okay, that ended that rather quickly, didn't it? What I wanted to tell you about his inventions, there is an organization in Italy that has actually taken his many of his inventions on paper and they've actually built them. And they conduct a traveling exhibit. I don't know if they still do it, but years ago when my son and I were in California, we had a chance to see a traveling exhibit. It was absolutely stunning. So what I'm saying to you is if it ever shows up in your area, I don't know where it would be, Richmond or Norfolk or maybe Williamsburg at the Muscarelli Museum. I don't know where it would show up, but what I can tell you is if it ever does come to your area, please go see it. It is well worth your money to see the magnificence of this man, not only as a painter, but as someone who had mechanical knowledge, and he transferred that to actual inventions that made life easier for many people. He was an amazing, amazing man. If he were alive today, I can't imagine what he would do for us as people now. So let's take a look at Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel.
You have to crane your neck to get a good look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But most tourists are rushed to marvel at Michelangelo's Renaissance masterpiece. Awe overcomes the temporary discomfort. After 4 years of back and neck-breaking toil, his work was unveiled on the 31st of October in the year 1512, 500 years ago.
Painting by Botticelli.
Antonio Paolucci is the director of the Vatican Museums.
5 centuries ago, the Pope Julius II entered inside Cappella Sistina and can see the vault of Sistina completely painted by Michelangelo. The great work, the terrible work was finished.
It was an act of almost unrivaled artistic creation. Michelangelo considered himself first and foremost a sculptor and looked down on painters of frescoes. But Pope Julius II's invitation to paint the 5,000 square foot ceiling of the chapel was one Michelangelo, 33 years old at the time, could hardly refuse. In essence, he was learning on the job.
Scrutinium directe.
The Sistine Chapel is where cardinals meet for the conclave to choose the next pope, where popes conduct baptisms and special prayers.
Nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo.
In the last half millennium, it has survived wars, political upheavals, and inclement weather with surprisingly little damage. Just one section of the fresco depicting the biblical flood is missing. In 1797, it fell to the floor following a massive explosion in the nearby Castel Sant'Angelo. Today, the greatest threat to this priceless art comes from those who flock to admire it. About 5 million people visit the Sistine Chapel every year. That means 5 million people with sweat, with heat, with dust. The number of visitors is expected only to grow in coming years. The Vatican is planning to upgrade the current climate control system for the chapel, but officials are hesitant to turn tourists away.
It's not possible in this moment to limit the number of visitors of the Catholic that won't enter in Cappella Sistina from all countries of the world.
Michelangelo returned in 1535 to paint the Last Judgment on the chapel's wall. It took 5 years to complete this work, a work art lovers no doubt hope will remain intact until Judgment Day. Ben Wiedemann, CNN.
Okay, so here's something. I don't want to take away from the mystery and the awe of Michelangelo's work, but there was also a practical application. If the narrator says that Michelangelo considered himself a sculptor and looked down on painters, then why did he take this job? Well, the narrator says because of the magnificence of the ceiling chapel and he couldn't turn it down, blah, blah, blah. That's all true. But there's another practical application, money. He was being paid handsomely, and there are extant letters that show that his family was on him for money most of the time. And so think about this. Think about the practicality of that. When he's a sculptor, he looks down on painters, but he takes 4 years to paint the Sistine Chapel, and then he's ready to move on, and the Pope talks him into another 5 years doing the Last Judgment painting. That's 9 years of his life he spent working on in an art form that he didn't really like and look down upon. So, it's obvious that the money had to be a part of it, as well as he had this, he was multi-talented, as was Leonardo da Vinci, and so he exercised that freedom to do his painting, and of course the Pope probably paid him very handsomely for the Last Judgment as well. So I mean, all of this is all of the art mysteries, and the beauty of the work is there, but there are also practicalities, and he was paid handsomely. So let's take a look at the story of Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. Now, before I play this, I want to set this up. This is a movie, a Hollywood movie called The Agony and the Ecstasy. It stars Charlton Heston as Michelangelo and Rex Harrison as Pope Julius. And it is a movie that sort of it's centered around the painting of the Sistine Chapel, but it also is an exploration into the relationship between the two men, and it is very well done. Again, it's one of those old 50s or 60s movies. If you are interested, I'm sure you can find it at iTunes. I rented it here a number of years ago and enjoyed it.
If I had not taken the sword, if I had not become a conqueror, there would be no church, no pontiff, and no hope of peace to mankind.
Two great stars clash in Irving Stone's turbulent masterpiece that topped the bestseller lists for 83 weeks. Played against an age of brutality and glory. Of scheming and intrigue.
Silence! How dare you interrupt me?
But Your Holiness!
Wait! You'll have your answer, now wait.
And the brilliant outpouring of art in one of the most exciting eras in history.
Michelangelo will paint the ceiling. He will paint it or he will hang.
Obscenity! Shameful! Shameful and obscene!
What have you to say?
I will paint man as God made him, in the glory of his nakedness.
Once we love, it's forever.
Co-starring Diane Ciolento as Caterina de' Medici.
You, who preach the beauty and nobility of the human body, look what you've done to yours. You know, Michelangelo, you smell.
Heston as Michelangelo, the artist who did not want to paint, who even became a hunted fugitive to escape his destiny.
Have you seen Michelangelo?
Harrison as Pope Julius, who used every weapon at his command in the fiery conflict of two strong-willed men as they forged an artistic miracle.
I will not obey you!
Will not! Did I hear you correctly? Will not?
Yes. I'll destroy it first, with my own hands.
Okay, so there you have it, the agony, the agony of the ecstasy. What was that part in there? Oh, there was a part I was trying to remember between the two of them. Anyway, if you're interested, I'm sure you can find this at iTunes. All right, so now let's take a look at this is a sculpture, remember? Michelangelo, the sculptor. This is one of his beautiful works. It's a classical version of called the Pieta. And the Pieta depicts the light of Christ, the body of Christ after it's been taken off the crucifix. He's dead, and he's laid in his mother's lap, and you can see, look how beautiful it is. It's all proportioned. It's beautiful. Look at the robes, the detail in there. Now I'm going to show you a Mannerist version of the Pieta, also created by Michelangelo. And the distinctions of this are, so that you remember the difference between Mannerism and classical revival, is look at his torso. It looks much longer than it might normally be. It's the arms are twisted in misproportion. His neck is much longer and misproportion. His legs actually look shorter and misproportion. And then if you look at the arms of the two individuals holding him, they just seem much longer than they should be. And this is typical of Mannerism, is the distortion aspect. Now, why artists worked in the Mannerist version, I don't know. That's why I call it a rebellion. Just as, if you recall, I showed you the difference between the classical sculptures, and then we moved into the Hellenistic period. And all of a sudden, you see these dynamic, energetic pieces. I showed you Laocoon, with the priest and his two sons being attacked by the serpent, and then the one that's my favorite is Boy wrestling Goose. And we're going to see this again. Well, we won't in this class, but it happens again during the 18th century in Europe. There is another revival of classicism, which is followed by a movement called Rococo, which is much more playful, and some might even call more perverse. So why these opposites and contrasts occurred, I don't know, other than a rebellion, And of course, today I don't know that anything dominates. It seems like today everything is a go. All right, so that is it for the lecture. Let us go take a look at your assignment. And then, like as I said, there's one more lecture next week, and that's it. And that's when I'll talk about the end of the term. All right. And then the final exam. All right, let's go to weekly assignments. If I didn't comment on your research papers, I thought they were very well done. All right, so let us go here. Maybe that's the comment I wanted to make. I very much appreciated, if I haven't talked about that already. Did I do? Maybe I did last week. Okay. Anyway, so this is your assignment. It is a discussion board. You have a reading for you. It's called The Medici Family and the Arts. I'll have the lecture recording for you later. And your options are Da Vinci's inventions. Choose two or three that interest you and share how they were built, and highlight their intended functions. If you want to include images, that's fine. Examine the Mannerist movement. In your post, explain what artists are trying to achieve with this style. And then your other option is examine Brunelleschi's cathedral dome in Florence and highlight how it was designed and constructed. And then if you want, you can choose another topic related to this particular time period, the high Renaissance in Rome. Okay. And then no, I'm sorry. It covers both time periods. I'm confusing it with the isolated lecture I've done for the other class. This covers your time period between 1400 and 1564, so this can be either in Florence or Rome. And then, as always, you do a 3-paragraph post, reply with a paragraph to 2 others for 15, and this will be due next Wednesday, April 29th. All right? So that is it, ladies and gentlemen, for your lecture this week. As I'll repeat again, next week, Northern Renaissance is your last lecture. I'll talk more about the exam and the end of the term, okay? All right, have a very, very good week. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. Otherwise, please have a peaceful and restful and productive week. All right, bye-bye.